My name is David Buchbinder. I'm a special researcher on Chad and Sudan at Human Rights Watch, and I've been doing research mostly in eastern Chad, but also in West Darfur since January 2006. Basically doing research on human rights abuses and writing reports and then doing advocacy. That's the basic job. So starting in January 2006, I went to the southeastern Chad, in an area known as Darcila, and I went hugging the border, a stretch of the border, documenting recent cross-border attacks against villages in eastern Chad. So there was a lot of cross-border movements of militia groups that were going from Darfur into eastern Chad, attacking villages, basically with the motive of apparently cattle theft, right? So they would go to villages, take the cattle, and kill those who resisted. So I documented that. Some of that in some instances, there were many people killed. Usually there were 2 to 5, 10, 12, small numbers of people killed. That is a pattern of violence that has evolved with time. But one thing that is important about that is that there was an ethnic pattern to the violence. So generally it was non-Arab villages that were being attacked, and generally victims identified their attackers as Arabs. So that's a piece of research that was the sort of the kernel for my subsequent research on what's been happening there. Where that evolved was that incursions would go deeper into Chad, right? So you would have armed incursions maybe 60, 80 kilometers from the Chad-Sudan border. And you would also have victims of violence reporting that not only were there Sudanese militias coming across the border and attacking them, but there were also Chadians, people they knew, people they grew up with, appearing with these militias and participating in the violence. So, but again, there's an ethnic pattern where typically it's non-Arab villages that are being attacked by mostly Arab militias, but that does not really quite encapsulate the dynamic because the militias are not monolithic. And included among the so-called Arab militias are non-Arabs, even members of the very communities that are being attacked. So there's a complexity to the violence that I think needs to be understood to properly talk about it. But it does get complicated. More recently, I've been looking at the Chadian government response to some of this violence. The Chadian government of Chad is fighting a civil war. There are Chadian rebels that are based in Darfur, and those Chadian rebels are supported by the government of Sudan. So, in turn, the Chadian government has been supporting Sudanese rebels in Darfur. So there's a proxy war. So the governments of Chad and Sudan are backing armed proxies, mostly based in Darfur, and that is having a very important impact on sort of a local level violence. Where one thing that the Chadian government has done in response to this sort of threat of insurgency, of these insurgents, is that they have redeployed their border forces, and they have hardened certain strategic towns, and that has left a security vacuum, right? So they have evacuated border garrisons in order to defend strategic points along the border, and into this power vacuum there have been lots of increased incursions from Darfur of these militia groups. So the Chadian government has sort of prioritized fighting against its insurgents over protecting its civilians. So that's been a major problem, and part of what I've been looking at more is ways in which the Chadian government has been attempting to arm civilian groups in eastern Chad, sort of self-protection force, they call them, the groupe d'autodéfense. And that's a new problem that is potentially extremely explosive, because typically what happens is, as I said earlier, there is an ethnic pattern to the violence where it's generally Arab militias attacking non-Arabs. So what's been happening is Chad government has been funneling weapons to these non-Arab self-defense forces. So that sort of furnishing weapons along an ethnic divide in an area where there's been communal violence is potentially extremely dangerous, because obviously you are increasing the potential lethality of the conflict as you are putting weapons of war, these are Kalashnikovs, automatic weapons, into areas where there had been, basically conflict had been fought with primitive implements such as clubs and bows and arrows and spears. So you get also the potential for retaliatory attacks against Arab civilians, which is something that's been happening, which is something that's been documenting. So you have backlash violence against Arabs. That widens the cycle of violence. And the fact that this violence is now being committed with weapons of war also overwhelms the traditional conflict resolution structures that have existed, that historically have succeeded more or less with resolving these problems. So if you kill a person, you are obliged to pay blood money, the diya. The diya is 100 camels, right? So that's great. You pay 100 camels, you're absolved, that you're indemnified, people move on. But what happens when you kill 220 people, right? Or 400 people? There's no way you can pay that many camels. So the fact that there are now automatic weapons, fueling this conflict means that there's no way that the traditional conflict resolution structures can deal with them. So they overwhelm that, and that's when you get the risk of extreme mass killings.
When did this start, and do you think there was like a motivating factor that made this start when it did? Where did it emerge out of?
Well, the Chad-Sudan border is a questionable concept, right? To something like the United Nations, obviously the Chad-Sudan border is very clear. You can't cross it. Obviously they've had trouble getting the United Nations into Darfur. But for some of these local groups, it's just a dry riverbed, and so a lot of the people who live on either side of the Chad-Sudan border have trouble reconciling their national identity, either as Chadian or as Sudanese, versus their more local identity, either as part of an ethnic group or as part of a kingdom that predates these borders, such as Dar-Sila. Dar-Sila is a cross-border kingdom. Dar-Zagawa is a cross-border kingdom, Dar-Masali. So these are all traditional homelands of ethnic groups that straddle the Chad-Sudan border. So you have ethnic groups that are, occur on both sides of the border. So with this extreme permeability of the border, there's a long history of cross-border violence. You can't say that these attacks started at any time, because I don't see how you could put a date on the beginning of this. However, you can say when there was this tremendous increase in violence, and in my mind, in my understanding, that happened basically when you had these border redeployments, when Chad government decided to withdraw border forces in order to harden strategic towns. I think into that security vacuum, along with that security vacuum, there came just a total impunity. You were free, if you were a militia group, to cross into Chad and do what you would. And a crucial part of that also is that on the other side of the Chad border is West Darfur. And West Darfur is a place where the government of Sudan and its allied paramilitary proxies really consolidated military control pretty well, right? So the government of Sudan and its proxies were able to basically eliminate most armed opposition, especially along the Chad-Sudan border in West Darfur. And also you had large percentage of the population in these areas in IDP and displaced person camps. So what that meant was that these militia groups that had been doing the same kinds of activities in Darfur, raiding, stealing cattle, suddenly with the consolidation of control and with the relocation of large percentage of the population to displaced person camps, suddenly they had slim pickings. There was not the same opportunities for theft and and what had become a wartime economy of pillage. But on the other side of the Chad-Sudan border, there were plenty of opportunities, and so we started to see that kind of these incursions end of 2005, beginning of 2006, and they continued from there. Now, in terms of the motivation, I can't pretend to know what's in the mind of these militia leaders or these members of these militias. I can see what appears. I can attempt to hypothesize based on my findings in the field when I go to villages in eastern Chad that have been attacked, and they report almost universally that that those who attacked them took their cattle. Well, it stands to reason that theft was a motive for that attack. Now, subsequently, that was early in 2006. Subsequently, there have been attacks that have not been accompanied by theft, where where militias have come to villages full of civilians. These are not military targets, and burned villages, burned houses, killed people, raped women, and have not stolen cattle. That's a different pattern of violence, and that suggests that there's a different motivation. But unfortunately, I don't know what the motivation is.
Do you have any idea of what direction you see this taking? I mean, is it getting worse, better? Is there any changes?
Yeah, there are changes, and the changes, I think, are making it worse. So one of the things is the supply of weapons, automatic weapons, into communities, into civilian hands, right? And this, interestingly, is happening with both Arab and non-Arab ethnic groups. And how does that happen? Well, one way I know that it happens, there could be other ways, is that the Chadian government is not monolithic. So if you might have one member of government who is concerned about non-Arab civilians in eastern Chad and might find a way to get weapons into their hands, but you also might have an Arab member of government who might be concerned about Arab civilians in eastern Chad and might find a way to get weapons into their hands. So you have a government that is very prone to fragmentation, that is where there's a lot of access to weapons. And so that phenomenon of weapons into civilian communities, very dangerous, and that's a new development, and that does not bode well for the future of communal relations. Additionally, there is a major demographic shift, especially in this area of southeastern Chad where there's been so much violence, where you have now 140,000 displaced persons in a small area of southeastern Chad, and you have perhaps 30,000, 35,000 Sudanese refugees in the same area. So that's the refugees have been there since 2003. The displaced persons have been there since the beginning of 2006. So it's a very sudden shift in a very delicate area where there's particularly in terms of access to water. Now, in the rainy season, there's water everywhere. In the dry season, there isn't water everywhere. So everybody has to, everyone in the area, if they want water, they have to go to the same place. So when you have an additional 140,000 people, Chadians, and an additional 35,000 Sudanese refugees in a small area, all of a sudden you're going to have the problem of water is a bigger problem, and that also is a new development that is not good for communal relations, prospects for peace.